There's a lot to feel great about being Australian, like our spirit of mateship and making the most of the many opportunities we're given. We're known for our courage and resilience and our passion. Most importantly, we believe in the idea of a fair go. Not just having one, but also giving one in return. We are vibrant and distinct as one of the most diverse societies in the world. While our stories may begin in different places, we're bonded by a common future that we will create together. So look around. It's easy to find inspiration to participate in your Australian citizenship. That means getting out there, being part of the community, and helping to create a sense of belonging. When every single one of us are just that little bit inspired to get involved, together as Australians, we can be truly inspiring.
Welcome to another of our Inspiring Australians Lunch with Leaders events. My name is Morgan Lewis and I'm the CEO here at Auspire, Australia Day Council WA, and I will be facilitating today's session with our Young Australian of the Year for WA, Grace Forrest. We are all spread out today. We've got more than 150 people joining from all around the place, some even from interstate. I am, however, right here, smack bang in Whadjuk country, just a few hundred metres from the beautiful Year River, which is actually a very special place for the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of this land. They have been looking after this place and met and gathered here on this land for thousands and thousands of years, well before we did. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and especially for any of you who may be joining us online for this forum today. We are here today in recognition of World Day of Social Justice. And of course, we're here to hear from our amazing young WA Australian of the Year, Grace Forrest. Now, you would have probably read Grace's bio in the marketing materials for this event today. But in summary, Grace is the founding director of Walk Free, an international human rights organisation working to eradicate modern slavery, which indeed affects over 40 million people across the globe. And for those of you who didn't see it, I'd like to kick off today's session with Grace, sharing with you the moment that she was announced as the 2021 WA Young Australian of the Year.
Give me a little sense of what the last few years have been like, Grace, with such a lofty ambition, but then the need to actually do something to make it work.
We fundamentally believe at Walk Free that the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And the fact that there are more people living in slavery today than any other time in human history, that they exist in every country in the world, and indeed in transnational supply chains, certainly in some Australian businesses, the last few years have looked like trying to keep that firmly on the agenda for business and government leaders around the world. And I'm extremely proud of Australia's efforts in the introduction of the Australian Modern Slavery Act, which is some of the strongest legislation in the world on supply chain transparency.
I was interested to read the other day that you are launching a campaign to pressure business leaders around the world to clean up their supply chains in the wake of COVID-19. Just explain that a little bit to us.
Well, slavery is a manifestation of extreme inequality, and it disproportionately affects women and girls around the world. So what we've found this year, conservatively, is that 1 in every 130 women and girls on Earth is living in modern slavery. And the scary thing is that this issue could be as close as the clothes that you're wearing tonight, the coffee you drank this morning, the technology in your pocket. It is truly an omnipresent problem, and one that is, as I said, connected to businesses. And where there is the greatest risk to slavery, there's the greatest opportunity to end it. So Walk Free is the non-government secretariat of the Bali process. We work with major businesses around Australia and in our region. And what we find in the Asia Pacific, our backyard, our neighbourhood, is that we're the region with the most amount of slavery, and we have the greatest responsibility to fix that.
Well, we congratulate you on this award tonight. It's a magnificent achievement. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So much has happened since that night, Grace, where your name was called out and you were up on that stage. Tell us a little bit about the experience of going to Canberra for the Australian of the Year Awards. You were obviously surrounded by some pretty amazing people who have done some incredibly inspiring things. Can you share with us a little bit about that experience?
Thank you so much, Morgan. It was such an incredible experience. I felt so blessed to be a part of it and to really be able to go, because for Western Australia being the closed state that we largely are, it was amazing that we could go and attend, and only 2 of the 4 of us finalists went. But I'm so grateful, because I would have been the only young Australian not there otherwise. And I think that in these uncertain, strange times, I don't know when we'll all be able to be together again. So it was incredible to all come together, people all over the country, from all corners of this amazing country. And you get to spend a lot of time with the people in your category, and all the Young Australian of the Year finalists were just exceptional people. I had a lot of imposter syndrome being there, actually, but I felt so grateful to meet them all. And Izzy Marshall, who's our national Young Australian of the Year, is just a legend. And there's so much crossover between her work and Walk Free's, really talking about period poverty and where women and girls are systematically held back. We know that modern slavery is an issue that disproportionately affects women and girls, and where there's entrenched cycles of inequality and structural poverty, the two really feed in together. But further than that, I think all of the Young Australian of the Year finalists, we're all fighting in some way to even the playing field for those less fortunate, and trying to use our privilege and our platforms and our voice to ensure that everybody is included. And it was just really incredible to see that crossover, and meeting all the finalists was very overwhelming. And I think someone who I was really impacted by was Kirby White, the local hero from Victoria. Again, she's just a true Aussie legend. And I'm meeting her and her husband, who just did incredible work to safeguard and protect remote and regional communities during COVID, really off their own back, going above and beyond as healthcare professionals. It was just so inspiring. And I really wanted to thank her for her work, ensuring that Australia is one of the leaders in the world on fighting COVID-19. And that is, to me, it's really because of people like Kirby, just as much, if not more, than our national elected leaders stepping up to that challenge. And of course, Grace Tame, just what an Aussie icon. I couldn't have been more happy that a young woman won that title. And again, so much crossover between voicelessness and oppression that I saw, but especially for survivors of trafficking, slavery and abuse, it does all cross over. And, obviously it's been horrific seeing what's come out in Canberra over the last week, but I think voices like Grace have paved a way that we now can't go back from. And I'm really proud of that. And I'm really excited about what more can come from that cultural shift.
You absolutely did get to rub shoulders with some really inspiring people, but I'm sure that they were equally as inspired by you. Let's not kid ourselves. You don't need to suffer from any of that imposter syndrome that we all so often do. Grace, I want to get into the modern slavery piece. Can you just talk to the audience today? What actually is it? I mean, we've heard you talk a bit about it, but what is it? Break it down for us in rural layman's terms. And why does it affect us? Why is it important that we understand it?
Modern slavery is the systematic removal of a person's freedom, where one person is exploited by another or a company. So it's an umbrella term that encompasses a number of highly exploitative practices, including human trafficking, forced labour, debt bondage, organ trafficking, and forced marriage. Slavery today looks very different to how it did in the past, but what it has in common is the commodification of human beings and a person being unable to make basic decisions in regards to their body, life, and future. And we actually know that conservatively, There are some 40 million people living in modern slavery today. That's more than any other time in human history. And for the elements of our economy, it's deeply entrenched in the goods that we buy and use every day. So whether it's the clothing that we wear, coffee, technology, chocolate, seafood, we know that these are industry level risks. And that's why Walk Free exists to tackle the structural systems change that must occur in order to safeguard industries and create greater genuine transparency, as well as partnering with grassroots frontline organisations and empowering survivor voices.
So essentially, that gives us some perspective. That's why you started this organisation, Walk Free, the global movement that you founded. Tell us a bit about Walk Free more broadly and explain, obviously you're here based in Perth, but this is a global issue, about how you can impact and how you do impact from right here in WA.
So Walk Free is an international human rights group focused on the eradication of modern slavery in all its forms in our lifetime. No small goal. And what that means is working with a number of key stakeholders of the problem to ensure that we create a wraparound solution that is sustainable and culturally relevant to every part of the world. So our key stakeholders include faith, government, business, civil society actors, and international groups like the United Nations, the International Labour Organization. And essentially what this means is that we need to address modern slavery for why it occurs and where that vulnerability is. So take migration vulnerability as one example. We've seen a huge exacerbation of vulnerability for migrant workforces in the last year, where people have been trapped in host countries, excluded from national health plans, and then not paid for their work. And this might feel something that's far away from us in beautiful Australia, but it's not. It's directly connected to the clothes that we buy. Say, take Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of women who are employed to make the clothes that we buy and use were not paid for orders that were made from multinational companies. So essentially, Walk Free seeks to exist about holding that accountability level to the highest standard and ensuring that under domestic and international law, that's unacceptable. I think it might be surprising to some people to find out that different forms of modern slavery actually are still legal around the world. So there are 136 countries existing now that are still yet to legislate against forced and child marriage. And where we know that where this systematic removal of freedom and bodily autonomy exists, there is no chance for genuine sustainable development. So eradicating modern slavery in our lifetime, of course, is the right thing to do. It's somewhat ridiculous that we have to sit here and even talk about the continuation of modern slavery. But it's also the smart thing to do. It underpins all international development and really underpins where we're going as a species on a philosophical level. I don't think we can keep moving forward when modern slavery is still existing all around us.
Look, you've only touched on some of those horrific statistics which your Walk Free team has uncovered clearly through the work you do. How do you guys go about exposing some of this stuff that's, quite obviously and quite deliberately hidden from view?
Look, I think, so I probably should have been a little bit more specific there with what Walk Free does, and I'll just list them quickly. We're a co-founder of the Freedom Fund, which is the leading frontline sustainable liberation group in the world. We're the creator of the Global Freedom Network. We're the non-government secretariat of the Bali Process Government and Business Forum. Terrible name. Essentially, that means that we sit alongside the Australian and Indonesian government that brings together 45 member states of our region, where we know that 70% of the world's people living in slavery reside, to ensure that there's a transnational response and one that comes from a business and a government level so people don't fall through the cracks. And perhaps most importantly, we're the creator of the Global Slavery Index, which is the world's leading data set on measuring and understanding modern slavery. So we measure slavery in every country in the world, and I'd just like to contextualize some of the statistics that we look at. So 40.3 million people is a snapshot of a figure taken over a 5-year block. Human trafficking and modern slavery is something that's constantly moving. So we know that over a 5-year period, some 90 million people actually experienced modern slavery in some form. And again, that 40.3 million, what that looks like when we break it down. As I said, slavery disproportionately affects women and girls. But to the effect that it does, it's actually 1 in every 130 women and girls on Earth. 1 in every 130. We know that across the Commonwealth, that 1 in every 150 people are living in modern slavery. And globally, 1 in 200 people on Earth is living in modern slavery. So these are massive, massive numbers. And to flip that on the other side of who's responsible for this, we also look at measuring the economic impact. So instead of this being seen as a first world, third world problem, which is, of course, just a complete false dichotomy in a globalized world, we're looking at the import risk, the world's most powerful nations. So the G20, the world's most powerful wealthy countries, has a collective $354 billion import risk of goods at high risk made of modern slavery. Australia owns around a $12 billion import risk of that amount. And what I can tell you is that all of these numbers, import risk to those living in modern slavery, are absolutely conservative, as our last index was done before COVID-19. And we know anecdotally from our partners around the world that the ramifications of this pandemic for the world's most vulnerable people have been severe. So measurement is critically important to this space. We now partner with the major UN agencies to ensure there's just one number. And we're really proud of that, because it now means that businesses can't say, oh, it's some NGO problem or some government problem. This is not a disputable thing anymore. And just 5 years ago, if I'd brought up modern slavery in a boardroom, this is Walk Free's 10th anniversary this year, actually. But just 5 years ago, bringing up modern slavery in a boardroom, it was a complete non-issue. You might get shoved to CSR or told, oh yeah, took to our charity partners. And now it's a top 4 board priority. And that is in part because of the Modern Slavery Act here in Australia. But I think illumination and shining a light in a place that the world where these issues have existed in darkness for too long, and more importantly, connecting that darkness and exploitation to the decisions made by the world's most powerful people, that's hopefully a Pandora's box that we'll never come back from, and we'll keep pushing this forward to ensure that everyone feels responsible for the continuation of modern slavery and everyone feels a part of ensuring that it's ended.
Now, Grace, obviously you do a lot of your work from here in Western Australia, but I know you do get out into the field. You've visited many, many countries and, you know, obviously many unlikely destinations for a young woman in her 20s. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the places you've been, some of the things you've personally seen and actually dealt with right there in real time?
Yeah, so we are a Perth-based international human rights organisation, which is quite amazing. There was nothing like this that existed when I was at university, so we're really proud of that. But we are an international team. We have people working out of Washington and London and partners in every region of the world. And certainly the experience that inspired Walk Free came from a grassroots experience that I had when I was just 14, working with children who'd been rescued from child sex trafficking, some of them as young as 3 years old. And certainly we are driven very much at Walk Free by systems change, but also by the inherent value of every human life. And I don't think you can really see or understand that or should have the responsibility of working on it unless you've been in those communities that are affected by it, and unless you use your platform to ensure that those communities get the voice to speak to their governments, and you can act as a bridge. That's how I see myself, between the highest halls of power and the communities most affected. That is the responsibility of what we do here at Walk Free. So I have travelled to a lot of destinations where slavery occurs, and I do some photojournalism of that. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what modern slavery looks like, and I'd be more than happy to share that portfolio with this audience if they're interested afterwards. Some of the places that Walk Free's operated on a government level and also very much in communities are Islamabad, the Bekaa Valley, Pyongyang in North Korea, Varanasi, lots of different places, but I thought they were a few interesting ones. And certainly tying exploitation, systemic exploitation that happens with that we buy and use every day. I've seen that working in Thailand, where I was interviewing fishermen working on boats, catching the seafood that many of us eat. 70% of Australia's seafood is imported from Thailand. And I could not find a single person who worked on these boats who had not experienced exploitation in the form of their passports being removed, their pay being withheld, and unable to get off their boats. Every single one of them had signed up for a 3 to 6 month contract, and some of the men had been left out at sea for years. Equally, I did not interview a single person who had not witnessed at least one murder at sea, when someone had tried to question the captain on this morale. This is happening in the 21st century right now. And again, this is connected to the shiny tuna cans we see in Coles and Woolies. It's not far away. And I think that the reality is we talk about our system being broken. Our system isn't broken. It was very much built this way for convenience at the cost of anything else. And certainly modern slavery and extreme exploitation. It's also connected to environmental degradation, issues we're seeing around climate change. And we need our elected leaders to see these issues as interconnected. And certainly when it comes to COVID-19, as I said, the vulnerability of migrant workforces, of which I've interviewed many in Jordan, in Lebanon, 2 host countries that are taking largely women from across the Asia Pacific, our region, our neighbours, and across Africa. Their case studies are in this group. And again, these women came to seek genuine employment to support their families. And I did not interview a single person who had not experienced violence and exploitation. And this is just completely unacceptable. This normalised exploitation, it needs to be addressed up front by the countries that are sending and receiving, and certainly by the transnational companies that are benefiting from this economic cost.
Grace, you mentioned earlier about, as the clothes that we wear, the phones in our pockets, the tin tuna that we buy from Woolies. As consumers, we want to be conscious consumers, and there's got to be ways that we can understand really how much this is affecting the way that we live. What can we do? What simple things can we do? Because not everyone needs to stand by the policy and the supply chain changes that were made, legislated. What can we do? How do we check this stuff? How can we be better conscious consumers?
Yeah, and look, this is a great question because it's still difficult to be a conscious consumer. There's so much greenwashing that we see happening, and that's difficult for us. We're glad to see the conversation shifting around more accountability, but we're also worried about how confusing it is for consumers to find something that's genuinely fairly made. But I would say on that the quickest way any of us give up our power is by not knowing how much of it we have. And as consumers, we vote for the kind of world we want to live in every day with the way we spend our money. So why not choose to spend your hard-earned money with businesses that can give you a guarantee about the living conditions in which the products were made? More and more we're seeing this with fashion. And what I can guarantee you is that if a website has no information about their workers, but bangs on about sustainability and consciousness, it's absolutely greenwashing. People that would exploit other people to make a cheap good and claim to protect the environment, they will never protect the environment if they're hurting other human beings in the process. So really, this is about transparency. Some certifications that can give us guidance are fair trade. I always look for that with coffee, chocolate. And the thing is, there's this misunderstanding that ethical necessarily means expensive, or that expensive necessarily means ethical. It's not as simple as that. Aldi, love Aldi, has more fair trade options than the other supermarkets, and they're the same price in many ways as their competitors. And then, of course, there's Oxfam stores that are not only fair trade but have a social impact. And we always try and do Christmas and Easter shopping there around that time. But I'd just say in the supermarkets, fair trade's a great one to look for. And looking with something that is more of an investment rather than your everyday shopping, say a new item of clothing, have a look, or even just ask them on social media or ring them up and find out about that. And if they can't give you an answer, that's really not good. More and more people can give answers, but I think it's about starting a conversation and knowing that we actually are owed that information as consumers. And if they can't give it to us, I'm not sure we should be spending our money with them.
Grace, as a young leader, what advantages do you think that young leaders have in creating change that maybe some of us older people and your older counterparts maybe don't have? Can you talk about young leadership and how it's different for you, the advantages in creating change?
Well, I'm incredibly inspired by young leadership in this country and around the world. I think the advantages that young people have are that more and more we're being taken seriously as agents for change, and that we're not scared to call something out for the core of the problem rather than the symptoms that exist around it. I think that we live in a system which is push down, pop up. We focus on one thing and not the other, and we pretend that they're not interconnected when they are. And I think that young people aren't afraid to go to the kind of extreme root cause, which can make things overwhelming, but it also helps us discuss something from a very tangible high level. And the climate change movement has been able to do this in a lot of really powerful ways. I also think that more and more, there's some pretty scary realities that are coming at us from this pandemic, from the disregard of the climate science that now is being taken seriously, but should have been taken seriously a while ago. And I think that young people realise that we will be tackling these problems as adults. And we needn't wait to be adults to express our opinions and to be active citizens. But I would caveat that in saying that something that I just absolutely loved with the Australian of the Year Awards and with the Auspire Awards here in WA was the interconnection of young leadership and senior leadership, and about one voice moving forward. And certainly with the finalists that we had in Western Australia, who were just all absolute mentors of mine and such legends, Rebecca Prince-Ruiz, Professor Helen Milroy, and Dr. Richard Walley. Again, all of us are working towards very different things, but they're also not different at all. And it does come down to basic human rights. It does come down to being responsible for each other and looking at the cracks in our system and addressing them, and also thinking about how we challenge the status quo, because who created that and who does it serve? It certainly does not serve everyone. And certainly between Rebecca and I on the plastic pollution in the world and human exploitation, the two are interlinked. And certainly between Helen and Richard, who are just two exceptional leaders in our country, and I wish they had far greater platforms and audiences listening to them every day than they currently do. I think we need to understand as a nation who we are, where we've come from, in order to move forward properly. I think young people have a unique advantage to be a bit spicier, to call things out as they are, to hold people to account who are in positions of power, but they're in positions of power because we voted them in. And, we've seen CEOs resign now over big scandals that happen in their companies. They are there to service the public. And if they are hurting other people to serve a certain group, that's not okay. And I think young people aren't scared to call that out. We're not scared of systems change, but I also think that young people and young leadership is at its best when it's being mentored and interconnected with intergenerational leadership. I don't really subscribe to the young leaders will save us. We won't. We need to learn from where we've been. We need to connect with exceptional leaders like Dr. Richard Walley. We need to learn from them, and we need to carry that torch.
It's a really great observation, that interconnectedness that you have seen and obviously felt when you were in Canberra with the others. Look, we're starting to get some questions through on the chat. I will remind everybody, please do send them in. They're being curated by the team in the background, and we will get to those shortly. We've got a couple more, Grace, and then I'm going to go and look and see what's coming in on the chat line. So, Grace, ending modern slavery within our lifetime, it's obviously a really lofty goal. What keeps you going every day? Is there something tangible that you kind of just touch on every day when that problem can seem so vast? What keeps you focused and keeps you on it?
Well, a few things. I think the first one would be that far too much in life relies on a genetic lottery. And being someone who won the genetic lottery, being born in a safe country, never having to worry about getting sick from drinking water out of the tap, never having to worry that my education wouldn't be valued as equally to my brother's, that in and of itself is extreme privilege. And I think that with any kind of privilege comes great responsibility. It's not okay that I could, by luck, be born here and another girl could be born elsewhere. And by the time she's 9 years old, she's being married against her will, and she's not going to have access to her own freedom. And I think that oxymoron, that irony, that is something that it's a huge systems change fix that needs to occur. But eradicating modern slavery, it's not a utopia. It's about raising the bar for the world's most vulnerable people, especially in relation to where we're benefiting from that exploitation. the legacy of historical slavery and the continuation of slavery now, they are interconnected. The same countries that were exploited back in the days of the transatlantic slave trade still struggle now with a number of major challenges. And I think it's naive to pretend that they're not interconnected. I think there needs to be an accountability around that, an acknowledgement of our history, where we've been and where we're going, and a line in the sand to say, who do we want to be as a people? Isn't it also a little bit ridiculous that in 2021, we have to thank a government for bringing in basic standards for businesses to not have slavery? It's unbelievable we're still having this conversation. And I think part of the role of Walk Free is ensuring that it's so pushed into the public agenda that no one can look away from it. And then bringing the key stakeholders to the table to ensure that it's sustainably eradicated and to ensure that survivor voices are forefronted and seen as people equal to all of us, not a varying level of human rights, which I think this does come down to as well. We view different countries or different groups of people as being able to have access to different areas of human rights, different levels of human rights, and that's just not okay. And I think that, again, something that we hear over and over is, oh, well, isn't someone lucky to have a job at all, rather than not having a job? But no one is lucky to be exploited. No one is lucky to be in a job where they're not even paid. They can't even have their own kids live with them because they can't put food on the table. Or in its most extreme form with slavery, they can't even leave that occupational environment. That's not lucky. That's horrific. And a number of people said to me, oh, well, aren't those children lucky to work at all? No, if these major chocolate companies, Nestle, Mars, Hershey's, paid people fairly, which, by the way, they can afford to do, they're multi-billion-dollar companies, they could pay the parents of these children fairly for their labour, for the goods that they grow on their farms, and then those parents could afford to send their kids to school. So I'd actually say it's a problematic idea that someone's lucky to be exploited. So we're fortunate enough to buy chocolate en masse in supermarkets. And I think that, again, this is about visibility and giving tangible solutions, which is why we work with major businesses, including all three of those, on how to tangibly tackle this within the supply chain and ensure that exploitation doesn't continue as a norm.
Grace, we've got some great questions coming through, so I'm going to look away while I get some of these up on my inbox here. We have a question from Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. Ruth's actually got 4 students with her today. And Ruth's asking the question, you were clearly exposed to this at 14 years of age. What was that experience that put you in that situation?
Sorry, I'm just replying to some questions in the chat. I was in high school and I had the opportunity to go on a school service trip, and I was could choose what we wanted to work on, and I saw this human trafficking safe house and I didn't even know what that was, and so I selected to work there, and that experience fundamentally shifted my perspective of the world as well as my place in it as a young woman. And I actually became completely obsessed with the issue and was told by many adults around me that, yes, it's sad, but this only happens in the dark corners of the developing world, and, don't lose sleep over it. But I'm sorry, any one child trafficked should make people lose sleep, let alone hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And so I actually, when I finished school, much to my parents' dismay, moved to Nepal and worked in a safe house. And I actually found that orphanage where I'd originally worked had re-trafficked all of the children. So a problem that already seemed so difficult to get one's head around became a lot more complicated. And, as a result of that, it's why we don't believe in Walk Free involuntarism. People that are trying to do the right thing, but often, orphanage trafficking, it's another part of what we do. It's quite niche, and we work with a partner called Lumos on this, but we know that some 80% of orphans actually have families that can take care of them. And again, it's a problematic Western aid model that runs this, helping people in one country when actually for a fraction of the price to sponsor a child, you could help a family have a sustainable job, look after their own kid. So yeah, that experience happened when I was quite young. And again, my idea of change was to go and to start my own orphanage. And then I radically learned that wasn't going to create a systems change that was necessary. And I lived in Nepal when I was 17, turned 18, had my 18th birthday in Kathmandu. And after that year, I realized that this was very much about a systems change, because unfortunately for every child that you pull out of slavery at this point, another one will go in, and it's about addressing, even though it's harder to get one's head around, the supply and demand of this problem. So yeah, I went on to study international human rights and political science, and Walk Free was founded, as I said, 10 years ago today, and I studied through that time, and now we're really proud of the team of experts that we've convened and we work with every day.
Grace, I've got another question here from Katrina. She says, obviously, thank you so much for this opportunity to ask these questions, and obviously how horrendous and disproportionately modern slavery affects women and children. She's saying, how do you feel, even though, the Australian government has implemented legislation around this, how do you feel about the fact that there are no penalties associated with organisations not reporting or not mitigating risks and exposure to modern slavery practices?
Katrina, this is such a great question. And it was something we really grappled with at Walk Free when we started the heavy lobbying around this. We actually didn't believe in its interim that there should be penalties for businesses. And that was simply because, one, we didn't think the legislation would get passed if it did. We came in under a Conservative government, so it was more important to get something in than nothing. But secondly, because slavery is so omnipresent in international supply chains, it's certainly touching all major companies across Australia unless there is a seriously proactive response to fixing it. And even then, the industry vulnerability on a global scale makes it difficult for one actor to be ethical. We wanted the conversation to move in a way that businesses knew they had to authentically look. We were warned by people in the UK who worked on that legislation that things were buried in its interim when they talked about penalties, which of course it's self-reporting. So look, I think the legislation is so much better than nothing. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Do we want to see penalties come in the future? Yes. But we wanted the first round, and I encourage everyone watching this to look at who does bring out a statement and who doesn't. And if a company doesn't, 100% assume that they're guilty. I don't believe in innocent until proven guilty. Look at who puts out a statement, and you will see vulnerability across those statements. I've reviewed a number of them, and it is really, really difficult to have a perfect statement at this point because of the lack of transparency. So for us, it was more important about starting a conversation, moving that dial, ensuring that boards were taking this seriously, but also giving some time to get the frameworks in to create that genuine sustainable change, not just ticking boxes, which again, we have seen people create these policies that mean absolutely nothing. And we don't want that. We want a sustainable shift. And do I think there's space for penalties to come in the future? Absolutely. I hope boards are held to the highest level of account on this from a corruption and scandal level in the years to come. But I think we wanted to give a head start to push this out into the public and really make it stick. But it will be interesting as we go through this first and second reporting process to see how that works. And again, a lot of it came down to playing politics on just getting something up rather than nothing.
Grace, there's a question from Amy and a similar kind of theme coming through from Leslie. Obviously, they've both said thank you so much for all your work. It's absolutely outstanding what you've achieved. But the question is about influencing more broadly our local community to be more ethically minded in how we consume and how we purchase. And are there great places where there's resources that groups can actually help to advocate for what you do and share that information to make it easier for whole communities to maybe build an army to support this cause?
Definitely. And I think also from a number of levels. So Walk Free produces the Global Slavery Index, as I said, but we've actually published to date 67 publications on slavery. We're probably the leading group globally on doing this. And all of these publications are free, and they're on varying levels of where you sit in your community. So we're working on a teaching guide right now for schools. We have one around business engagement. We have one on faith. We have one on regional faith areas. So there's an Australian Freedom Network, which we co-created up from the global one. There's also one in India, one in Colombia. So it's about that cultural relativity. But certainly in Australia, there's the faith engagement. When it comes to consuming ethically made goods, I think the first and simplest thing I would say is support local, support farmers markets, support things that are being made here, because that is a safe way of doing things. Of course, in the globalized world that we live in, there's an app called Good On You, which can help check brands on how ethical and sustainable they are. It's definitely not perfect, but it's a great starting point. Then there's ethical made easy, well-made clothes. Honestly, I know it sounds simple, but it's as simple as when it comes around to Valentine's Day, Googling ethical chocolate options, or Easter, where can I find, child labour free, for goodness sake, Easter eggs. And at Christmas time, we put out an ethical Christmas list this year. It's available for free online. So yeah, there are resources, and if you go to the Walk Free website, there's a lot of them there. Some of them will be useful to individuals, some of them won't be. And Walk Free is also on social media, so we're always happy to answer questions and point people in the direction of better ways we can equip ourselves with this information.
There's some excellent resources there. I guess the hardest thing is, what's the elevator pitch? What do we say if we really want to get on board? What do we say to the person next to us or the person in our community to really influence that behavioural change? Are there any highlight little pitches that have made an impact, that have influenced, that you've used?
Well, I don't buy anything unless I have certainty around the origins of the product. And that can be as simple, and don't get me wrong, often people can't answer the question, but around, is your coffee fair trade? I ask that in any new cafe I go into. And sometimes they'll say, no, it isn't, but we know the supplier, and there's transparency on it. If they say they've got no idea, the same thing. I often ask, do you have any certification around child and forced labour? And often people look at you like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you even asked that question. But again, if they can't answer it and that information isn't there, that's really not a good sign. And there are a lot of ethical clothing options out there that do give this answer. And I want to touch on the monetary side of things around this, because we can't buy our way into an ethical world. Of course, when you want to buy something new, if you can afford to buy something ethical, that's great. But the wardrobe you could ever have is the one you already own, and taking care of the goods that we already have. Probably 80% of my wardrobe is vintage or secondhand. Actually, both the things I'm wearing today are secondhand or borrowed. This is my mum's. So it's actually about looking after what we have and not seeing anything as disposable. People often ask me, oh, Grace, well, should I not be buying a $5 t-shirt from Kmart? That's what I can afford. And I'm not here to judge anyone's purchasing of what they do. But what I would say is that a cotton t-shirt on average is touched by 100 pairs of hands, from the growing of that cotton to the manufacturing of the shirt. And if you divide $5 by 100, imagine that 3 people at the top are getting 80% of that. It isn't fair. So nothing is ever cheap. It always costs someone something. In saying that, mass production can cut the margins right down. But if you are buying a t-shirt from a $5 t-shirt from somewhere, I just say don't look at it as disposable. I think the biggest issue with fast fashion is that, fast fashion, terrible business model for ethical consumption. But the worst thing that people do when they buy fast fashion is think, oh, it's not worth mending. It's not worth looking after. I own things from fast fashion companies before we were this in depth with Walk Free, and I fix them when they break. I look after them. And I think that it is twofold. It's about consuming more mindfully. It's about asking simple but hard questions about the origins of the things you buy. Social media is a great way to do this. I ask everyone on Instagram, and that you see what they answer, and if they don't answer, I don't shop with them. But it's also about valuing what we have and knowing that we can't buy our way into this. It's about asking questions, spreading transparency.
I think you've answered. We had a question from Narelle around that, so I think you've answered that one, so thank you. An interesting one's come through here actually from Leslie, and that's about I guess the knowledge that fashion and alcohol advertising has, I guess, a traffic light report, a traffic light system, or a traffic light report you can access when making choices. But we haven't seen this with, say, food and groceries. We've seen it on fair trade coffee, of course, and chocolate, but not groceries per se. Do you know if there's any work going into labelling, like we've just described in with food? Do you know of anything about that, if it's happening?
Yeah, we've been actually working on something around this for about 6 years with the labelling side of things. The reality is that currently, if you see a tin of tuna labelled with whatever, the reality is you cannot buy a tin of tuna that isn't touched in some way by modern slavery. So it's an industry level vulnerability. And because of that, certification of groceries gets really difficult to verify. And for us, it's more important to be having these conversations on a board level around that vulnerability and creating industry movements and transnational responses through the Bali process, because a certification on certain things right now, it just doesn't mean anything. which is a bit depressing, but it's so important. Coles and Woolworths both show instances of slavery in their supply chain. And obviously, a lot of people say, gosh, that's awful that they've got slavery in their supply chains. It doesn't, I would have been absolutely knocked me over with a feather shocked if they hadn't found it, or I would have known they were lying. They were absolutely going to find it. And I think that this is the strange cultural time that we kind of need to bear with them through, is that slavery is so omnipresent in our economy that they will find it. And what is important is about what they do about that and how they work with those at-risk suppliers to create genuine protection mechanisms for migrant workforces, for workforces in countries where there isn't legal protections. I want to say that the Australian way of life and our Australian values, they should extend through our international supply chains. No Australian company should be claiming to be doing good by the Australian public while harming other people offshore in the process. So it is about moving the dial and looking at that. And so on the certification front, I think understanding the vulnerabilities within, say, Coles and Woolworths supply chains, and ABC did a brilliant report out on this. I think that helps us understand the products that are more at risk. And again, I saw someone say, yeah, great, buy local. I think as locally as we can buy, I think that the way that we live in a lot of ways is deeply unsustainable. And it's an unpopular opinion to say this, that we all need to buy less and that we need to not expect to eat every kind of fruit at every time of year. We need to eat more seasonally. We need to live with more within the realms of what we can grow here in Australia. And of course, I'm not naive enough to think that that will change everything on modern slavery, but it is important to put our money where our mouth is, where our values are, and supporting farmers and farmers markets and supporting local is a way that you can safeguard against that. And watching the movement around the modern slavery statements, I do think we'll get to a point where we can certify, but we are not there now. Even with the B Corp certifications, they're good. They're not perfect. And good on you, it's good, it's not perfect. There is no golden standard, which is why I'm not advocating for one on here. I'm saying it's about moving the dial in conversation, and it's really about transparency and accountability.
Mm. Well, look, we've got about 8 minutes left. I would like, if there's any more questions, to come through from the chat. This is the chance to do that. Grace, I have a question for you, and it's probably one of those utopias. It's basically, let's look ahead to the day that modern slavery is no longer a problem. What are you going to do?
I'll be a chef. No, look, I think the reality is eradicating modern slavery in our lifetime is about raising the bar. It's about saying we have a basic level of exploitation, basic level of expectations, for every person on this planet. We expect basic things for all people, and it's about leveling the playing field. And certainly modern slavery is interconnected with all of the world's greatest challenges. And really this is about creating visibility around the interconnected world that we live in, and understanding that, you know, for COVID-19, safety in a public health crisis is a team sport. So while we were advocating right thing to do, the morally good thing to do, we saw countries like Singapore, who didn't include migrant workers in the National Health Plan, get their cases down to almost zero, then open up these sheds that essentially migrant workers were all locked in, to let them back out to clean their houses, to clean the streets. And what do you know, 8,000 cases overnight in that country. And so while, of course, I think it's morally bankrupt that they didn't include them in the first place, if the world worked on morals and altruism, I wouldn't be sitting here. It doesn't. The economics of it makes sense to eradicate this from an economic and political perspective as well. And in a crisis, the world's most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable people in communities, if they're excluded, it will continue to create crisis going forward. So whether it be refugee camps, whether it be migrant labour forces, ensuring that no one is excluded, because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. So yeah, I guess I hope I'm not still working on this in decades to come, but I have no doubt that there are some things that can be changed over the next few years, and legal eradication of modern slavery is hopefully one of them. Ensuring extreme transparency and accountability, that's something we're working towards over the next 10 years, that no business can exploit another person. But we are also talking about intergenerational change here. So I'm not under any illusion it's going to happen quickly.
Yeah, there's one last question here I'd like to ask before I wrap up. It's from Narelle, and it's perfect after you spoke about you don't want your children to grow up still dealing with this problem. is there, that you know of, an education program about modern slavery for children in Australia? So is it something that is in our schools that we can teach through the civics and citizenship program and curriculum? And if not, there's another project.
Yep, working on one right now, actually. I just replied to Narelle in the chat. But certainly we've seen an uptake of this issue in schools, but it has come down to individuals wanting to make that shift. There's nothing in the national curriculum. What I learned at school, like learning about modern slavery is learning about social justice. It's learning about human rights. It's learning about our history in our country and around the world. It's connected to a lot of things, and we have seen some incredible school uptake and fundraising and engagement of schools around Australia. But again, that's been led by individual teachers. We've been working with the Catholic Youth Festival on a curriculum program for Catholic schools, but we want this to be in all schools. We do. And again, I think that the cultural shift around the Modern Slavery Act and learning that accountability, in my experience, children have a far easier time understanding these issues, why they're wrong and why we should fix them, than adults. They don't try and argue with you on it, whether or not people should have human rights. They're like, that's wrong. How can we change that? And we've seen entire schools that have engaged with Walk Free become completely fair trade, run fair trade Easter stalls, do some really amazing stuff. And the other thing that we're working on is actually a master's program on modern slavery. I studied social justice at uni. I didn't learn anything about slavery at uni. What people are learning now in different courses in many different fields is the data that we have written. So we are really working on a higher level education program on that, because there's excitingly going to be jobs in this field to helping businesses say around modern slavery statements, and new expertise coming through, which I'm so excited to see.
It's perfect timing to, I think, wrap this up. Everyone took an hour to come and listen to you, sit at their desks with their sushi or their Vegemite sandwich. Grace, thank you. I really wanted to just let everybody know that this Inspiring Australians Lunch with Leaders series is actually just one of the many initiatives that our small team here at Auspire, the Australia Day Council WA, curates and delivers as part of a year-round program of events with our Australian of the Year alumni. We work closely with individuals and schools, local communities and governments to promote the concept of inclusion and social cohesion and, of course, leadership in civics and citizenship. And we do that largely through capacity building, training and workshops, but also through events like this. I do encourage our participants who joined us online today to jump onto our website and see that full suite of our programs. And please reach out to us if you do have the desire to host a workshop or to do some training with your team or your community. We also encourage you to, at this point in time, you've just heard from an outstanding young Australian who is our WA 2021 Young Australian of the Year. So I encourage you to look around yourselves in your networks and identify those who inspire you through the work that they do or the cause that they champion, and nominate them for the 2022 Australian of the Year Awards, because nominations are open now and it is really, really super easy online, and it's at australianoftheyear.org.au. That should be up on the screen shortly, and if not, we will also post it in the chat. I also wanted to plug our next Lunch with Leaders. It is to celebrate Harmony Week. And we are very, very privileged to have the 2021 Australian of the Year Local Hero recipient, Rosemary Kariuki, as our speaker. Grace, you may have had the chance to meet and speak with Rosemary when you were in Canberra.
She's amazing.
Yeah, had some similar stories to talk to you about.
A lot of crossover.
Yeah, a lot of crossover. So Rosemary is a wonderful local hero, and she is going to be joining us for one of these events on Thursday, the 18th of March. So we do hope all of our participants are able to join us for that one. I did want to close off by saying thank you so much and acknowledging that The Australian of the Year Awards National Diversity and Inclusion Partner is Chevron Australia, and you've got a group that have joined us today from your workforce. So thank you for participating and for your ongoing support. It really is important to us. Thank you, Grace, for your passion, but also your unwavering sense of purpose. It's really obvious. We certainly look forward to hearing a lot more from you throughout the year in your role as WA Young Australian of the Year. And I also want to thank our audience for taking the time out today to join us online for lunch. We absolutely love having you, and it is a privilege to get your time. We do look forward to seeing you, hopefully, at our next lunch with Leaders with Rosemary on the 18th of March. So that's it. Great, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.